Magnus Eriksen emerged from his stone-arched tunnel after 8 weeks buried under 40 feet of snow, along with 30 refugees who had fled to his underground sanctuary when the Whiteout of '63 crushed every other homestead in Eagle Valley. While 200 settlers died across the Colorado Territory, that March, Magnus's tunnel system, built after losing his family to an avalanche, created a breathing, self-sustaining shelter that protected its inhabitants through the deadliest blizzard in Rocky Mountain history. Drop your location in the comments and hit subscribe for more incredible survival stories from history. March 2, 1863, arrived with a peculiar yellow light that old-timers recognized as the herald of catastrophic weather. By noon, the sky had turned black as night over the Colorado Territory, and snow began falling in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. This was no ordinary storm. Pacific moisture had collided with Arctic air directly above the Rockies, creating what meteorologists would later classify as the perfect snow-producing machine, warm enough to carry massive amounts of water, cold enough to drop it all as dense, crushing white death. The Brennan Ranch was among the first to succumb. Timothy Brennan had just stepped outside to secure his livestock when the snow intensity exploded from heavy to impossible. In the time it took him to reach his barn 50 feet away, 18 inches had accumulated. By the time he fought his way back to the house, snow was already piling against the door. His wife Mary would later be found still holding their infant daughter, both frozen in their bed after the roof collapsed sometime during the first night. Eagle Valley took the worst of it. The terrain funneled moisture-laden clouds into a natural trap where they dropped their burden at rates that defied comprehension. 6 inches per hour became 8, then 10. The snow wasn't the dry powder of normal winter storms, but heavy, wet concrete that adhered to vertical surfaces and built impossible loads within hours. The Henderson family's new cabin, built with pride just the previous summer using the strongest timbers available, lasted exactly 14 hours before its roof beams snapped like matchsticks. Communication between homesteads became impossible within the first day. The Jacobson brothers, who lived only 300 yards apart, both died never knowing the other's fate. Samuel Jacobson was crushed when his chimney collapsed inward. His brother Eric suffocated when snow sealed every ventilation point in his cabin. Across the valley, similar tragedies played out in isolation, each family fighting their own losing battle against the accumulating white mass. By day 3, the snow depth had reached 25 feet in the valleys, with drifts approaching 40 feet against any vertical obstruction. The weight was staggering nearly half a ton per square foot on horizontal surfaces, but worse than the weight was the sealing effect. This wet snow created an impermeable barrier, turning surviving structures into airtight tombs. The lucky ones died quickly when roofs collapsed. The unlucky survived the structural failure only to slowly suffocate in spaces that had become sealed coffins. The storm's fury continued for 5 full days. When it finally exhausted itself on March 7th, Eagle Valley lay beneath a white ocean averaging 35 feet deep, with drifts reaching 60 feet in wind-loaded areas. Chimney pipes that had stood 15 feet above roof lines were buried completely. 2-story houses had vanished without trace. An entire populated valley had been erased from existence in less than a week, leaving only subtle undulations in the snow surface to hint at the tragedies beneath. November 15, 1859, had dawned clear and cold in the high country above Eagle Valley, where Magnus Eriksen had built his first Colorado homestead. The Norwegian immigrant had chosen the site carefully, nestled against a protective ridge with southern exposure for his small cabin. His wife Astrid and 4-year-old daughter Anja were preparing breakfast while Magnus split wood 30 yards from the door. The crack that changed everything came from above, a sound like thunder that every mountain dweller feared. The cornice along the ridge had grown heavy with early-season snow, extending 20 feet beyond the rock face in a graceful but deadly arc. Temperature fluctuations had weakened its connection to the mountain, and that morning it chose to fall. Magnus looked up to see a white wall descending, not rolling like a normal avalanche, but dropping straight down like a frozen waterfall. He screamed a warning that was swallowed by the roar, running toward the cabin even as he knew the mathematics of disaster made rescue impossible. The avalanche struck with the force of a freight train. The cabin didn't just collapse, it exploded under the impact, logs scattering like thrown sticks before being buried under tons of concrete hard snow. Magnus was caught at the edge of the slide path, tumbled and battered but miraculously thrown clear. When the roaring stopped and the snow dust settled, silence fell over a landscape transformed. Where his home had stood, only disturbed snow remained, already settling and hardening in the morning cold. He dug with his hands until they bled, screaming their names until his voice failed. Other settlers arrived by afternoon, bringing shovels and hope, but the snow had compressed to the density of ice. They found the cabin's remnants 12 feet down, crushed flat as paper. Astrid and Anja had died instantly, a mercy that did nothing to ease Magnus's agony. The speed of burial, the totality of destruction, the helplessness of watching death fall from above these images would drive his every decision for the remaining years of his life. Magnus spent that winter in Eagle Valley, taken in by the Turner family, but living inside his own grief. He studied the avalanche site obsessively, returning daily to examine snow accumulation patterns, wind effects, and terrain features. He noticed how snow built predictably in certain locations, how wind created loading patterns, how temperature changes triggered releases. What had seemed random to most settlers began revealing patterns to his desperate observation. Snow behaved according to rules. Understanding those rules might prevent another family from disappearing beneath white death. By spring 1860, Magnus had filled 3 journals with observations and sketches. He interviewed every avalanche survivor he could find, collecting stories of burial and escape. He learned that snow killed in 3 ways: impact, suffocation, and cold, but that properly designed structures could address each threat. The principles forming in his mind were revolutionary. Don't fight the snow's weight, redirect it. Don't seal against it, breathe through it. Don't stand against its force, let it pass over. Magnus Eriksen spent the summer of 1860 traveling the Rocky Mountains like a man possessed, studying every avalanche path and failed homestead he could locate. At Kenosha Pass, he found cabins split in half by snow pressure, the uphill walls crushed while downhill sections remained intact. The pattern was clear. Snow behaved like a slow-motion fluid, flowing around obstacles and concentrating force at specific points. Traditional rectangular cabins created pressure zones at their uphill corners where snow accumulated until structural failure became inevitable. In Georgetown, he interviewed miners who had survived cave-ins, learning how underground spaces could withstand pressures that crushed surface structures. They showed him arched tunnel supports that distributed weight evenly, preventing the point failures that killed men under collapsed timber squares. Magnus sketched these designs obsessively, seeing applications beyond mining. If arches could support mountains of rock, properly designed arches could support mountains of snow. His Norwegian heritage provided crucial insights other settlers lacked. In the valleys above Bergen, his grandfather had built stone shelters called snowhus that shepherds used during winter storms. These weren't cabins but integrated landscape features, built into hillsides with curved roofs that let avalanches pass harmlessly overhead. Magnus had helped maintain these structures as a boy, never imagining their principles would matter in Colorado. Now he understood their genius. They worked with natural forces rather than against them. September found him at the site of the Hartman tragedy, where an entire extended family had suffocated when snow sealed their cabin. The structure itself had survived, but the occupants died when wet snow created an impermeable seal around every opening. Magnus spent days examining the site, noting how snow had packed against walls, how it had bridged over certain features while filling others. He discovered that specific angles and surfaces could create air pockets, that proper positioning relative to wind patterns could prevent complete sealing. The mathematics of snow accumulation fascinated him. He measured drift patterns around rocks, trees, and ruins, documenting how obstacles created predictable zones of deposition and scour. A vertical wall might accumulate 30 feet of snow, while a surface angled at 45 degrees would shed accumulation continuously. Wind-facing edges created high-pressure zones where snow compressed to ice, while lee sides developed soft deposits that could be excavated easily. Every observation added to his growing understanding of snow architecture. By winter's approach, Magnus had developed preliminary designs that incorporated everything he'd learned. His sketches showed structures partially buried by design, with curved surfaces to shed avalanche forces and integrated air shafts positioned in natural low-pressure zones. Most radically, he envisioned entrance tunnels that would remain accessible even under extreme accumulation, using stone arches to maintain structural integrity under any snow load. Other settlers who saw his drawings thought him mad, planning to live like a mole. But Magnus had seen too many surface dwellings become tombs. If survival meant going underground, he would build the finest underground shelter ever conceived. Magnus Eriksen arrived in Denver on April 3, 1861, leading 3 freight wagons to haul back materials no homesteader had ever thought to purchase. While other settlers bought lumber and nails, Magnus sought stoneworking tools from mining suppliers, specialized chisels, sledges with specific weights, and tempering equipment for maintaining cutting edges. At Kaufman's Mining Supply, he ordered 1,200 pounds of blasting powder, not for mining gold but for quarrying stone with surgical precision. The stone itself required careful selection. Magnus had identified a granite outcropping 2 miles from his Eagle Valley claim, where natural fracture lines would allow extraction of curved pieces ideal for arch construction. He spent weeks studying the rock face, mapping weak points and stress patterns. Norwegian stone-building traditions emphasized working with natural grain rather than against it. Each piece needed to fit precisely without mortar, held in place by geometry and gravity alone. His neighbors watched with bewilderment as Magnus established what appeared to be a commercial quarrying operation. William Davis, whose claim bordered Magnus's land, found him one morning carefully splitting a massive granite slab along a line of drilled holes. "Building a castle, Eriksen?" Davis joked. Magnus simply replied, "Building something that will last." The stone he extracted wasn't random rubble but carefully shaped pieces, each numbered and stacked according to a master plan only he understood. The quarrying technique itself drew from Norwegian methods refined over centuries. Magnus drilled holes 6 inches deep along natural fracture lines, spacing them precisely based on the stone's grain. Into these holes he drove wooden wedges that he soaked with water. As the wood expanded, it split the stone cleanly along predetermined lines. The process was slow, perhaps 3 usable pieces per day, but produced stones that needed minimal finishing to fit together perfectly. By August 1861, Magnus had accumulated over 400 shaped stones, each weighing between 50 and 300 pounds. He built a sledge path from quarry to building site, hauling stones during early morning when the ground was firm. The physical labor was crushing, but Magnus worked with the steady rhythm of a man building his own salvation. Each perfectly fitted stone represented another degree of protection against the white death that had taken his family. The construction site itself required extensive preparation. Magnus excavated into the hillside, following natural bedrock contours that would support his planned tunnel system. He installed drainage channels first, understanding that water infiltration could destroy underground structures as surely as snow destroyed surface ones. French drains filled with graded gravel led water away from planned foundations. Every detail reflected lessons learned from tragedy. If his family had lived underground, properly protected, they might still be alive. Local skepticism turned to outright mockery as Magnus's excavations grew. Eriksen's folly became the common term for his growing hole in the hillside. But Magnus continued his methodical work, stone by stone, drain by drain, building something that would prove its worth when the next great storm arrived. The first arch Magnus Eriksen completed in September 1861 stood only 4 feet high, a test structure to prove his calculations. Each granite piece had been shaped to precise angles, fitting together without mortar in a compression curve that grew stronger under load. He piled rocks atop the arch, adding weight until the pile reached 6 feet high. The arch didn't shift. Where a flat roof would have collapsed under half that load, the curved structure channeled force into the ground, demonstrating the principle that would save lives 2 years later. Construction of the main tunnel began with the entrance portal, positioned based on exhaustive wind pattern studies. Magnus had observed that prevailing winter winds created a low-pressure zone on the lee side of a specific rock outcropping. Snow would accumulate heavily elsewhere, but leave this area relatively clear. He built the entrance here, framing it with massive cornerstone blocks that weighed over 400 pounds each. The opening faced downward at a 30-degree angle, preventing snow from drifting directly inside. The tunnel itself extended 20 feet into the hillside before opening into the first chamber. Magnus constructed it using a technique called false arch building, where temporary wooden supports held stones in place until the keystone locked the entire structure. Each course of stones was laid with mathematical precision, creating a parabolic curve that distributed weight evenly. The tunnel width, exactly 5 feet, wasn't arbitrary, but calculated to prevent snow bridging while allowing easy passage. Integration with the cabin structure represented Magnus's greatest innovation. Rather than building a traditional cabin that could be buried, he created a hybrid dwelling partially underground, partially exposed, connected by his tunnel system. The cabin's uphill wall was solid stone, built into the hillside itself. The roof, instead of flat timber, consisted of stone arches covered with earth, creating a living surface that would shed avalanche forces like water off a duck's back. The ventilation system drew from mining engineering, but adapted for snow conditions. Magnus installed 4 separate air shafts, each rising through the hill at different angles and elevations. He capped them with stone boxes featuring louvered sides that would remain clear even under heavy accumulation. The shafts connected to a central plenum chamber where air mixed before flowing into living spaces. Even if 3 shafts became blocked, the 4th would maintain adequate ventilation. Most remarkably, Magnus built multiple chambers connected by arched passages, creating redundancy no surface cabin could match. The main living space, kitchen, storage rooms, and even a small stable for livestock were distributed through the tunnel network. Each chamber featured its own supporting arch system, meaning localized failure couldn't cascade through the entire structure. Stone shelving, carved sleeping alcoves, and integrated drainage channels made the space livable rather than merely survivable. By November 1861, Magnus had completed the basic structure. Neighbors who had mocked his excavations fell silent upon seeing the finished tunnels. The graceful stone arches, illuminated by oil lamps, created an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. But this was no church, it was a fortress against the White Death, engineered to protect life when the next great storm arrived. The winter of 1861–62 provided Magnus Eriksen's first real test of his tunnel system, though nothing approaching the catastrophe that would come. December brought heavy snows that buried conventional cabins to their eaves, but Magnus's entrance remained accessible, protected in its calculated wind shadow. Inside the tunnels, the temperature held steady at 45 degrees, while neighbors fought to maintain freezing in their drafty cabins. But the true innovation revealed itself in how the structure breathed. The 4 ventilation shafts worked like Magnus had theorized, creating natural convection currents that circulated fresh air continuously. Warm air from the living spaces rose through the upper shafts, while cold, dense air sank through the lower ones, establishing flow without mechanical assistance. He had positioned each shaft to emerge in different snow accumulation zones, ensuring at least one would remain clear regardless of drift patterns. The louvered stone caps shed snow while admitting air, their angled slots preventing ice formation. Ice prevention occupied weeks of careful engineering. Magnus discovered that moisture from breathing and cooking would condense in cold sections of the ventilation system, potentially creating ice plugs. He addressed this by lining critical sections with smooth granite that he heated periodically with oil lamps. The stone absorbed and retained heat, keeping shaft temperatures above freezing. Additionally, he installed cleanout ports every 6 feet, allowing removal of any ice accumulation before it became problematic. The emergency exit system demonstrated Magnus's thorough planning. Beyond the main entrance, he constructed 3 escape tunnels, each emerging at different elevations and directions. The primary escape route led uphill, emerging near the quarry site where wind scour kept snow depths minimal. The secondary exit opened into a natural cave Magnus had discovered and modified, creating a hidden refuge stocked with emergency supplies. The third tunnel connected to a reinforced surface structure disguised as a woodshed but actually serving as an alternative access point. January brought the first significant test when a 3-day blizzard dropped 8 feet of snow. The main entrance remained functional, but Magnus noted how quickly the snow accumulated against his marker posts. He spent hours observing accumulation patterns, adjusting his ventilation dampers to maintain optimal airflow as conditions changed. The livestock in the underground stable remained warm and calm, while neighbors lost animals to cold and suffocation in traditional barns. Most importantly, the tunnel system proved livable rather than merely survivable. The stone chambers maintained consistent temperatures, the ventilation prevented stuffiness, and the multiple rooms allowed normal family life to continue despite burial. Magnus hosted the Turner family for 2 weeks when their roof partially collapsed, demonstrating that his system could shelter multiple groups if necessary. Mrs. Turner, initially terrified of living underground, admitted the stone chambers felt safer than their damaged cabin. By spring 1862, Magnus had proven his concept. The tunnel system had performed flawlessly through a moderate winter. He spent the summer making refinements, additional food storage, expanded water reservoirs, and reinforced emergency exits, preparing for whatever nature might deliver. The winter of 1862 brought warning signs that Magnus Eriksen recognized, but his neighbors dismissed as typical mountain weather. December's storms arrived with unusual violence, dropping wet, heavy snow that adhered to structures like plaster. 3 cabins in Eagle Valley lost roofs to the accumulating weight, but repairs were made and life continued. Magnus observed the snow's density, its bonding characteristics, and the speed of accumulation with growing concern. These weren't normal winter patterns, but harbingers of something catastrophic. In January 1863, Magnus began extending his tunnel network with urgency that puzzled observers. He excavated a new chamber specifically for food storage, stocking it with preserved goods sufficient for 2 months. The Turner family, whom he'd sheltered the previous winter, found him hauling 100-pound sacks of flour into his underground storehouse. "Planning to feed an army, Magnus?" Robert Turner asked. "Planning to survive when others cannot reach their own doors," Magnus replied, his Norwegian accent thickening with emotion. The expanded tunnel system now encompassed over 300 feet of passages, connecting 8 distinct chambers. Magnus reinforced critical junctions with double arches, creating redundancy where failure would be catastrophic. He installed additional ventilation shafts, bringing the total to 7, each carefully positioned based on 2 years of wind pattern observations. Most critically, he excavated what he called the refuge chamber, a large central space capable of sheltering 30 people if necessary. Neighbors' reactions ranged from amusement to concern for Magnus's mental state. The Davis family openly mocked his preparations, calling his tunnels Eriksen's dungeon and joking about the Norwegian mole man. Even sympathetic neighbors like the Turners questioned the extreme preparations. Sarah Turner gently suggested that Magnus might be letting his grief drive him to irrational extremes. But Magnus had seen snow erase human existence in seconds. He would not be caught unprepared again. February 1863 arrived with deceptive calm that Magnus found ominous. The air held unusual moisture. The clouds stacked in patterns he'd seen before, only in avalanche conditions. On February 28th, he made unprecedented preparations, filling every water container, bringing his 2 milk cows into the underground stable, and lighting all ventilation-warming lamps. He also did something that would prove prophetic. He visited every neighbor within 2 miles, warning them of approaching danger and offering shelter in his tunnels. The response was universally dismissive. William Davis laughed outright, pointing to his sturdy cabin that had weathered 5 Colorado winters. the Brennan family politely declined, assuring Magnus their new roof could handle any snow load. The Hendersons were less kind, suggesting Magnus return to Norway if Colorado winters frightened him. Only the elderly Olsen couple, fellow Norwegians who recognized weather patterns from their homeland, took his warning seriously. By March 1st, Magnus had completed final preparations. Extra lamp oil, medical supplies, and emergency tools were distributed through the tunnel system. The main entrance was cleared and reinforced. All ventilation systems were tested and functioning. As the barometric pressure began its precipitous drop, Magnus stood at his tunnel entrance, watching the yellow sky darken, knowing he had done everything possible. March 2, 1863, struck Eagle Valley with violence that survivors would struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. The storm didn't arrive gradually, but exploded across the mountains like a frozen tsunami. Within 1 hour, visibility dropped to zero, and snow fell so thickly that breathing became difficult. Magnus Eriksen, watching from his tunnel entrance, saw his marker posts disappear sequentially. First, the 3-foot marker, then the 6-foot, then the 10-foot pole vanished into the white void. By midnight, the Hendersons' cabin, the same family who had mocked Magnus's warnings, collapsed with a sound audible even through the storm's roar. Their chimney, built to extend 12 feet above the roofline, disappeared completely by dawn. The Davis homestead lasted until noon on March 3rd, when accumulated snow sheared off their entire north wall. William Davis, who had laughed at Eriksen's dungeon, died trying to dig his family out through their roof before the structure pancaked completely. The first refugees arrived at Magnus's tunnels on March 4th. The Olsen couple, who had heeded his warning, struggling through 20 feet of snow to reach the entrance that remained miraculously accessible in its wind-protected location. Within hours, survivors began arriving in desperate waves. The 3 Turner children appeared alone, their parents lost trying to save livestock. Mary Jacobson crawled through the entrance tunnel carrying her infant daughter, her husband crushed when their chimney collapsed inward. Inside the tunnel system, Magnus's preparations proved their worth. The refuge chamber filled with survivors 15, then 20, then 30 people crowding into spaces designed for exactly this scenario. The ventilation system, despite snow accumulation exceeding all predictions, maintained fresh air through its redundant shafts. The stored food supplies, mocked as excessive, now fed desperate families who had fled with nothing. The underground stable sheltered not just Magnus's cows, but refugees' livestock driven inside during the early hours. Days blended into weeks in the lamplight underground. Magnus organized the survivors into work groups, some maintaining ventilation shafts, others preparing communal meals, still others caring for children and injured. The stone chambers echoed with voices of people who should have been dead, saved by architecture that worked with natural forces rather than against them. Outside, the snow continued falling 30 feet, 35. 40 feet of crushing white death that erased the valley's surface features entirely. The tunnel system performed beyond even Magnus's expectations. Despite loads that would crush any conventional structure, the stone arches held perfectly, actually growing stronger under compression. The breathing system maintained air quality for 30 people when designed for 5. The drainage channels prevented flooding as snow began its inevitable melt. Most remarkably, the entrance tunnel remained functional throughout, its calculated position keeping it accessible even under unprecedented accumulation. By the time the storm exhausted itself on March 7th, Eagle Valley lay beneath a white ocean 40 feet deep. Every surface structure had vanished. Cabins, barns, fences, even large trees were completely buried. But in Magnus Eriksen's tunnels, 31 people remained alive, warm, and fed. The man dismissed as a paranoid mole had built the only structure capable of surviving the century's worst storm. April 21, 1863, brought the first rescue parties to Eagle Valley, composed of military units from Fort Collins and civilian volunteers who had spent weeks digging through blocked passes. Captain James Morrison led the expedition, prepared for the worst after finding nothing but crushed cabins and frozen bodies in neighboring valleys. The scene that greeted them defied comprehension, an unbroken expanse of white with no visible sign that humans had ever inhabited the valley. Morrison's men began the grim work of probing for structures using long poles to locate buried cabins. Each discovery followed the same heartbreaking pattern: collapsed roofs, crushed walls, families frozen in their final moments. The Henderson cabin yielded 5 bodies. The Davis homestead revealed a tragedy where family members had died trying to dig upward through their collapsed roof. By the 3rd day, they had recovered 17 bodies and found no survivors. Then, Private William Hartley noticed something unusual: a series of stone markers protruding from the snow in perfect alignment, too regular for natural formation. Morrison ordered excavation toward what appeared to be a chimney pipe, though its position seemed wrong for any known cabin location. 3 days of digging revealed not another tomb, but a carefully constructed stone opening. Warm air flowed from its depths, carrying the impossible sounds of human voices. Morrison himself descended first, rifle ready, unsure what he would find in this underground anomaly. The tunnel opened into a lamplit chamber, where Magnus Eriksen stood calmly, as if he'd been expecting them. Behind him, faces appeared dozens of survivors where none should exist. Women, children, elderly couples, all alive and remarkably healthy given their 2-month burial. Morrison's report would later describe his disbelief. "We found them living as if in a hotel, warm and fed, while the world above had ended." The full scope of Magnus's achievement became clear as rescuers explored the tunnel system. 8 interconnected chambers spanning 300 feet of passages, all carved from solid rock and reinforced with precisely fitted granite arches. Ventilation shafts that had maintained air quality for 31 people through the worst storm in recorded history. Food storage areas still containing supplies, water reservoirs fed by underground springs, even livestock healthy in underground stables. Survivors told remarkable stories. Mary Turner described how the tunnels had seemed like salvation after watching their cabin disappear. "We thought we were entering a cave to die, but found ourselves in rooms warmer than our own home." Thomas Olson, who had lost his surface workshop but saved his tools in Magnus's storage chamber, had spent the burial time teaching young boys carpentry. Children had attended improvised schools. Adults had maintained schedules and routines that preserved sanity during the endless weeks underground. The engineering assessment came later, but the immediate impact was visceral. While Eagle Valley had lost 70% of its population, Magnus Eriksen's tunnels had saved every person who reached them. His folly had proven to be the only structure capable of withstanding forces that crushed conventional buildings like paper. The man mocked as paranoid had built the sole sanctuary in a valley of death. In 1998, a team of structural engineers from the University of Colorado examined Magnus Eriksen's tunnel system using ground-penetrating radar and computer modeling. Their findings confirmed what survivors had known for decades: the tunnel design anticipated principles of load distribution and snow mechanics that wouldn't be formally understood until the 20th century. The parabolic arches, positioned to transfer forces into bedrock, matched optimal curves calculated by modern software. The ventilation system's redundancy exceeded current building codes for emergency shelters. Professor Elena Rodriguez, who led the study, noted that Magnus had intuited complex physics through observation and tragedy. Without formal engineering training, he created a structure that modern avalanche experts would struggle to improve. His integration of natural terrain features, understanding of wind patterns, and exploitation of thermal dynamics shows genius-level environmental engineering. This wasn't luck, it was methodical application of observed principles. Magnus himself lived quietly after the rescue, refusing offers to patent or commercialize his designs. He published detailed construction plans in 1865, making them freely available to mountain communities throughout the West. His motivation remained consistent: no family should suffer what he had endured. He continued improving the Eagle Valley tunnels until 1870, when he moved to Denver to be near his new wife, Anna Larsen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who understood his dedication to mountain safety. The influence of Magnus's design spread throughout American mountain settlements and beyond. By 1875, Eriksen tunnels appeared in mining camps from Colorado to Alaska. The Swiss studied his ventilation principles for alpine shelters. The Canadian Pacific Railway incorporated his arch designs into avalanche shelters protecting critical track sections. Each adaptation honored his open-source approach. Safety knowledge belonged to humanity, not individuals. Modern avalanche-prone communities still use principles Magnus developed. The town of Gothic, Colorado, rebuilt after devastating slides, incorporated tunnel refuges based directly on his plans. Ski resorts maintain emergency shelters using his ventilation system design. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's mountain shelter guidelines reference historical tunnel systems that establish standards for snow load construction. Without naming him, they describe Magnus's innovations as foundational to mountain survival architecture. Magnus died peacefully in Denver on September 3, 1897, at age 71. His obituary mentioned his engineering contributions briefly, focusing instead on his charity work with immigrant communities. But in Eagle Valley, where his tunnels still stand, local historians maintain a different memory. Every winter, they light lamps in the refuge chamber on March 2nd, commemorating when one man's grief-driven obsession saved 31 lives. The tunnels themselves remain structurally sound after 160 years. Water seepage has damaged some sections, and the ventilation caps need periodic maintenance, but the core system endures. Visitors descending into the stone chambers find names carved by survivors' children who lived because Magnus Eriksen refused to accept that surface dwelling was the only option. The stones remember what official histories sometimes forget. Innovation born from tragedy, shared freely, can transform impossible survival into routine shelter. In Eagle Valley, the stones still stand, and in mountain communities worldwide, Magnus's principles still protect families from the White Death he knew too well.